Welcome everyone to a brand new explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly fascinating and honestly a deeply complex slice of American history. We are going to explore the history of New Mexico land grants. This isn't just about old maps and real estate. This is a story about a massive clash of cultures, completely contrasting legal systems, and a literal fight for the very ground beneath people's feet that has lasted for centuries. Okay, let's dive into this. 295. That is the exact number of recognized Spanish and Mexican land grants in the region that were eventually identified by the United States government. We're talking about 295 massive pieces of land given to individuals and communities to settle the vast western frontier.
But here's the central question that really drives this entire explainer. What actually happened to the millions of acres that were promised to New Mexicans? The answer to that question isn't just some dry legal footnote. It involves a dramatic, incredibly tense history of survival. Lots of broken promises, and a fierce, enduring resistance that, as you'll see, continues to echo today.
So, Section 1, Origins of the Land Grants, or as they were often known, the Commons.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the land that was lost, we first have to understand why it was given away in the first place. It all starts with a concept known as a merced. Basically, a merced was a land grant given out first by the Spanish crown and later by the Mexican Republic. These grants were governed by the laws of the Indies, which were codified way back in 1680. They were highly strategic. They were handed out to populate the harsh northern frontier, reward people for their service to the government, and absolutely crucial here, to create populated buffer zones between existing settlements and nomadic Native American tribes.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast in how these grants were legally structured. On one hand, you had individual grants. These were private tracts of land given to specific people, usually for private farming or ranching. But on the other hand, you had community grants, and these weren't owned by just one person. They were shared lands held in perpetuity for the entire community. People completely relied on them for grazing livestock, gathering timber, hunting, and finding medicinal plants. Honestly, these community grants were the absolute linchpin of rural survival in New Mexico.
Let's break down those common lands even further, because it's a brilliant system. A standard town layout had a central plaza, and surrounding it were the commons. You had the ejidos, which were lands used for communal benefit like recreation and threshing wheat. You had the dehesas, which were specifically dedicated pasture lands. And then you had the baldías, the uncultivated wilder lands further out. It's just incredible to consider how this legal structure allowed these tight-knit agrarian communities to ingeniously share resources and thrive together in a really unforgiving desert environment.
Section 2, The Turning Point, 1848.
Right, so everything changed in the mid-19th century. Let's quickly trace this timeline. In 1821, Mexico gains independence from Spain and continues issuing these land grants. But then, the Mexican-American War breaks out in 1846. That war ends abruptly in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And just 5 years later, in 1853, the U.S. finalizes the Gadsden Purchase for even more territory. In a staggeringly short period of time, the entire geopolitical landscape of North America was completely rewritten.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer geographic scale of what happened. Through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded more than half of its entire territory to the United States. We are talking about present-day New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado. This massive transfer affected approximately 80,000 Mexican citizens virtually overnight, with about 60,000 of them living in the New Mexico territory alone. So, when the dust finally settled, the U.S. identified those 295 land grants we mentioned earlier. And look at this breakdown. Over half of them, 154 to be exact, were community grants. Another 47 were individual, and 94 fell into other categories, including indigenous Pueblo grants. That means over 50% of the recognized land grants in New Mexico relied heavily on communal legal structures. Whole towns depended on shared access to that land.
Now, to ease this massive transition, the United States made a very specific, absolutely pivotal promise in the treaty. It explicitly stated that property of every kind belonging to Mexicans shall be, and this is the key phrase, inviolably respected. They promised to protect Mexican land titles under U.S. law. But, well, the tragic irony of this whole story is what actually followed that promise. Which brings us to Section 3, a legacy of dispossession. So what happens when traditional communal Mexican practices slam headfirst into strict Anglo-American private property laws? Well, disaster. How exactly was the promise broken?
It wasn't just one single event. It was a systemic breakdown. The U.S. set up processes to adjudicate these land claims, but the system was absolutely riddled with loopholes. You had erroneous surveys that artificially shrank the boundaries, you had mistranslations of the original Spanish documents, you had incredibly corrupt attorneys, famously known as the Santa Fe Ring, who actively colluded with federal officials to steal land. And later, a court of private land claims was established that was inherently adversarial. It demanded a very narrow, strict interpretation of Spanish law and actively sought to extinguish as many claims as possible.
If you look at these bureaucratic records from the U.S. General Accounting Office, they detail the tragic fate of these grants. Time and time again you see rejected, failed to pursue, immense tracts of land, thousands and thousands of acres that had sustained communities for generations were simply wiped from their hands through administrative hurdles and adversarial courts. Let's look at a specific historical example to see how this worked in practice. The Tierra Amarilla case. This is a perfect mini-narrative of dispossession. Step 1. In 1832, nearly 600,000 acres are granted communally to a group of settlers. Step 2. After the U.S. takes over, the Supreme Court of New Mexico just ignores the communal history and patents the entire grant to just one individual descendant. Step 3. A wealthy Anglo-speculator and attorney named Thomas Catron systematically buys out the heirs of that single individual. Step 4. Just like that, the communal rights of everyone else living there were completely extinguished. A thriving, shared community asset was legally converted into private Anglo-American real estate. And this wasn't just happening quietly in dusty courtrooms. The Maxwell Land Grant is another staggering example. Originally a Mexican grant, it eventually ballooned to an incredible 1.7 million acres, eventually falling into the hands of European investors and speculators. When they tried to use the new legal system to evict the settlers and miners who were already living there, it ignited the Colfax County War, an actual violent armed conflict. People literally died fighting over these clashing interpretations of land ownership.
Section 4. Resistance and Modern Activism.
Let's move to and see how this built, because the loss of these communal lands wasn't just a financial blow. It dismantled an entire agrarian way of life, and that profound loss created a boiling point. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, New Deal programs actually stepped in, purchasing some land and partially restoring access to starving communities. But when the New Deal ended in the 1940s, that land was transferred to the U.S. Forest Service, which heavily restricted grazing and woodcutting. So, the people were cut off from their lifelines yet again. This frustration simmered for decades, until the 1960s, leading to a massive rise in militant land grant activism. The fight has evolved since then, of course. By the 2000s, it shifted into highly sophisticated grassroots organizing and official recognition by the state of New Mexico. But the most visceral historical flashpoint of all that resistance happened in 1967. Activist Reyes Lopez Tijerina formed a group called La Alianza. Frustrated by a century of legal dead ends, Tijerina and armed members of his group actually raided the Rio Arriba County Courthouse. They wanted to perform a citizen's arrest on the district attorney to demand the return of stolen community lands. It ended in a shootout, wounded officers, and a massive statewide manhunt involving the National Guard. It showed the entire country just how deep the wounds of the 19th century still were. And you know those communities? They are still here today. Across the geography of New Mexico right now, despite massive historic losses, dozens of these community land grants are still functioning. They still have active boards of trustees, and they are still fighting every single day for recognition, access to resources, and survival. To truly grasp the scale of what happened, listen to this powerful testimony given to Congress in 1975 by sociologist Dr. Clark Knowlton. He testified that New Mexicans lost well over 2 million acres of private lands and 1.7 million acres of communal land. He flatly stated this loss was responsible for the destruction of traditional rural communities. It was, essentially, a wholesale dismantling of a culture's economic foundation. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to chew on. How do these 19th century legal interpretations continue to shape modern inequality and community identity in the Southwest today? The treaty was signed over 170 years ago, sure, but for the people of northern New Mexico, the fight for the common lands is far from history. It is their present. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.